As I mentioned earlier, this is Gretchen Shaw, Development Manager with NCADV. I'd like to welcome you all and welcome Brian Martin with Children of Domestic Violence. I'm going to go over a few brief housekeeping issues and give you an introduction to Brian, and then I'll turn the webinar over to him. So all attendees will be muted throughout the entire webinar. If you have questions, please type them into the question section or the chat section for questions directed to Brian. We will be answering those at the end of the webinar. Also, you can send any additional questions you have to my email address, which is gshaw@ncadv.org. You can also type messages into the chat section. I'll be monitoring those and answering as appropriately. So following the webinar, all attendees will be sent a recording and a link to a survey. We certainly welcome your feedback. Again, if you have further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. So today's speaker is Brian F. Martin. Brian Martin is an entrepreneur, founder, and CEO of the nonprofit CDV, Children of Domestic Violence, and the author of Invincible, The 10 Lies You Learn Growing Up with Domestic Violence and the Truths to Set You Free. He is also a weekly contributor to the Huffington Post. Brian is one of the billion people alive today who grew up living with domestic violence. The impact of his experience lasted into adulthood, but his quest for answers to long unasked questions eventually led him to a revelation, the unlikely gifts and hidden truths that the experience gave him and has given others who have lived through similar experiences. Brian and his work have been featured in the New York Times, the USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, and Forbes. He's testified before Congress, appeared on national television programs including Dr. Phil, and produced the award-winning documentary, The Children Next Door. So welcome, Brian, and thank you for doing this today. We really appreciate it.
Gretchen, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I just want to thank everybody at NCADV and Ruth Glenn, and thank you very much for the opportunity, and also everyone. Thank you for joining. I know everybody who's on the call, without question, is in some way you serve someone, or else you wouldn't be on this call with this particular topic, right? This is the topic where the people who gravitate to it are service and orientation. So it's really a privilege to get a chance to talk to you. I spent the past 7 years or so researching and working on a problem that touched me and my family, and I wanted to understand it better. Not just for us, but also for anyone else who experienced something similar. And during that time, I came across the work of researchers, and I came across the stories of others, thousands of stories. And at first, some of the things that I saw, it questioned a lot of my beliefs. Some of the things that I came across. At first, I kind of rejected them. But the more I stayed with them and the more I thought about them, the more time I spent and the more I tried, the more I realized that they were more true than I knew. And this research and the stories, coupled with my own experience, fundamentally changed the way that I live, the way that I work, the way that I think, and really instilled in me a very deep, deep desire to make certain that anyone who experienced something similar to what I did has access to what I now know to be the truth, and many other people know to be the truth as well. And the question that was the question that really surprised me was this question. It was, a question that we have to ask ourselves, which is, did you grow up facing adversity in your childhood home? Which is a question that we don't normally ask ourselves. And I don't know about you and what type of adversity you may have grown up with, or the people that you have the privilege to touch. 50% of all of us did grow up with some type of adversity, whether it's, our parents were, struggling with drugs and alcohol, or maybe some of us experienced sexual abuse, or maybe there was divorce, or emotional abuse, or mental illness. Or maybe there was physical neglect where, there wasn't enough to eat, or maybe the parents were too drunk or high to be able to take care of us. One may have been incarcerated. That was the case for me. Maybe we were, emotionally neglected. Or maybe there was physical abuse. Or this quipive one, which we'll talk about a little later, quipive. And if you experience one of these, 90% of the time, you experience more than one. And that was one of the first things that I kind of came across. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized this. I realized that, adversity faced in childhood is very different than adversity faced as an adult. And you may say to yourself, what do you mean by that exactly? I think it's kind of more easily illustrated, or not illustrated, something that's probably easier, more easily demonstrated.
Having emergency. Oh, my mom here. Get out of here. Bye. Are you getting I'm talking to the police, Mom. Stop it. Okay, we're going to be there. What's going on? Okay, I'm going to go fight because this is been going on forever and ever. What's the matter? Hello?
Yeah, that was the opening scene, or that is the opening scene from this documentary that we produced a few years ago. And when you listen to that, I think this point that adversity faced in childhood is very different than adversity faced as an adult. We don't even have, in childhood, you don't even have a developed brain. You don't even have a logical thinking center developed yet. We have all the emotional brain, but we don't even have any rational brain that's not even fully developed yet. Our nervous system isn't fully developed. We have no physical size. We have no freedom. So the more stories that I heard, the more I came back to this thought, or this question, and that's, if we can overcome that obstacle as a child, what obstacle can't we overcome as an adult? But first you kind of have to know, what that was. What did you hear? What did you experience? What was that? What would that little girl call it in that particular house? What you heard. Would she call it domestic violence? Would anyone? They might, but domestic violence is between adults. Was it child abuse? Most people, when they think of child abuse, they think of physical child abuse. That definitely happens in more than 50% of these homes. Was it emotional abuse? Yeah, but there's something more there than that. The researchers call it, I came upon this a bunch, quipive. Not sure if you've ever heard of that, but you saw it on that one of the first slides. But quipive is child witness to intimate partner violence. Less than 2% of people have ever heard of that phrase. And then we've got this word, witness. Most people who grew up in these homes have a real problem with the word witness, because the word witness doesn't adequately describe the impact. The truth is, most don't know what to call it. We actually don't even know that we should be searching for it or seeking out this information. And I illustrated that in a friend of mine gave me this data, which I found fascinating. And what he did was, he went on and he searched the term domestic violence for the past couple of years, 2013, 2014. So this chart that I'm not really looking at because I can't see the screen, but I can picture it in my mind. And what it is every single week there for like 2 years, this is how many searches there were in Google for the word domestic violence. And then you see this huge spike all the way up at the top, and that was right around when things were happening with the NFL. So you can see, like, that was a huge spike. But even during that time, when we then went back and researched how frequently in Google was the word domestic violence searched with either children, child, or childhood, you can see that bar chart right there because it's that on the bottom, that red line. The number of times that gets searched by people in this country, the word domestic violence, child, or childhood, or any of those combinations, I think the highest week was 42 people. I was probably 10 of them. But yet this is something that UNICEF says is one of the most pervasive human rights violations of our time. Right? It impacts 275 million children. It impacts 725 million adults. Who are those children? Many of them who are too ashamed because this is, under society's radar, and they don't really connect the dots between the issues they faced growing up and the issues they face today. And this is according to leading researchers. Many of them get away from the violence, but yet they still may be unable to live the life that they hoped for. Because if you grew up living with domestic violence, you experienced childhood domestic violence. Childhood domestic violence is when you grow up in one of those homes. And it can be physical or non-physical. I can't tell you how many of the stories are, in my home they didn't really hit one another that often, but what they did to one another with their words, I felt that physically. My mother and I only started talking about this a couple of years ago when I told her I was going to write this book, and we actually only started talking about because she told me that she had 3 months to live. Actually, her doctor did. And it's so frequent that, we can only talk about this when we believe that one of our parents is going to die. I don't know why that is. It must just be so shameful, so difficult to talk about that we can't even bring it up. But we did start talking about it, and the one thing that she reiterated to me, well, she actually reiterated it to someone who was interviewing her on a phone for the book, and I was listening on mute. She didn't even know I was on phone. And one of the first questions that the guy asked her, he said, Marilyn, can you start off by telling us a little bit about what your childhood was like? And she said, oh, it was violent. And now I was on mute, and I remember saying, no, Mom, he's not talking about your childhood. He's talking about mine. And I didn't really understand that at the time, because then she went on to share that she pretty much experienced the same thing that I did. And I never even for once contemplated that she grew up in the same type of home. But one thing she said, many things struck me, but one thing she really said struck me. She said, in my home, I faced many adversities, and, there was a lot of physical child abuse. There was a lot of emotional abuse. There was obviously childhood domestic violence, but that this thing that, if they just were able to stop using the words and pointing these words at me as to who I'd never be, I think that my life would have been very different. And that just goes to show you, in a home where there's tremendous physical violence, in many instances, it's this non-physical violence, which is the thing that most stays with us. And it doesn't need to last forever, meaning even brief periods of stress at a key time in development of the brain resulted in alterations that lasted well into adulthood. A good friend of mine, Jeremy, who's in the book, he recounted a story where his father was just, done with his mother, and then turned to Jeremy and started using his words on Jeremy. And Jeremy backed away and said, when I get older, I'm going to kill you, right? You know that, don't you? And his father took 2 steps back, went out of the house, and never came back. Never came back. He did send Jeremy cards like every year, but he never came back. And at the time, Jeremy, he was only 6. So it's like we only begin really forming memories, 4, 5. So it was only a couple of years. You think maybe he would have forgotten it. But no, he was real serious about his promise. I mean, he started training every year. He would train all year long because he was planning on killing his father. He even joined the Navy so he could get very good at it. He became a Navy SEAL. And then finally he was about to be let off on leave, and he got called up into the chaplain's office, and the chaplain said, Jeremy, I'm so sorry, your father just passed away. And that was the weekend that he was going to go kill him. So it's like, where does all that rage go? What's the impact on someone who grows up living with domestic violence? Well, there are many, but one of the simplest ways to understand what happens is that it negatively wires a developing brain. It actually encodes a series of negative beliefs early in life. And I learned this from a researcher who we worked with. He said it's actually one of the weaknesses of our species that the brain seeks to find evidence that it believes is true, even if that is false. So if early in life you really believed that it was your fault, that there's something wrong with you, that if people really knew the truth about you, that shame, right, that they would never want to connect with you. If your brain really believes that early in life, then it seeks to find evidence, and that's why so many believe they're guilty or resentful or sad or life is just, it's really meant for me to be alone, or I'm just an angry person, or things are hopeless. They always end up that way. I am fearful. I am worth less than most. I'm terribly self-conscious of myself. How can you not be if you believe all these things? And if I believe all these things about me, who would ever possibly love me? And then, we act and feel in accordance, typically, with what we believe about ourselves. That's how we act, and that's how we feel. So is it any wonder why people who experience childhood domestic violence are 6 times more likely to commit suicide? They're 50 times more likely to be addicted to drugs and alcohol. I'm 74 times more likely to commit a violent crime than I have. 90% of prisoners grew up in these homes. We have difficulty in our relationships. And of course, the single best predictor of whether you'll be in a domestically violent relationship is whether or not you grew up in one of these homes. But we spend so little time doing that. Can you imagine if we spent so little time dealing with the root cause of lung cancer, right? What's the best predictor of getting lung cancer? It's whether you smoke. Everybody knows that. What's the best predictor of whether you'll be in a domestically violent relationship? Where you grew up with it. Nobody knows that. But we also have to consider this question of, but what if we're not? Many of us on this call probably grew up in one of these homes, but we're not dead from a suicide. We're not addicted beyond repair. We're not incarcerated currently. We may not be in a domestically violent relationship. What if we're not? What explains that? Maybe someone stepped in to help us understand that, adversity faced in childhood is very different than adversity faced as an adult. And if we can overcome that as a child, what can't we overcome? Maybe someone stepped in to help us see a truth that we couldn't see for ourselves, which is what all of the researchers say is the pathway to resiliency. When an adult can step in and say, obviously, it's never a child's responsibility for the actions of an adult, right? It's not your job to stop this. You had to overcome obstacles that other children never had to even face. I believe you. This wasn't your fault. Maybe those words sunk in at some time, and maybe it's possible that we're not guilty, that it's never a child's job to control the actions of an adult. And when you begin to make yourself aware of what happened, then you can finally feel free. And when you can finally feel free, you can actually act when you need to take action. Maybe we're not fearful. Maybe the reality is there are very few fears that will ever impact an adult that compares to the fear faced in childhood. Maybe we're not fearful. Maybe when we believe that, we can tap into our natural confidence, which is what we are. And we're confident when we tend to take actions that prepare us. Maybe we're not naturally resentful. We may resent what happened, but we're not resentful. But it's hard to not be resentful when you don't have compassion for yourself. And how can you have compassion for yourself if no one ever told you that it was worthy having compassion for, when you can't even describe what it is? We can only have compassion for others when we have compassion for ourselves. And that's truly what we are. That allows us to assume positive intent. We're not sad. We may be down at times, but we're not sad people. We're actually very grateful to be out of that house. And when we can stop and realize how we may have it difficult at times, I promise you someone else has it worse. And when you begin serving them, your own life takes a very different meaning. We're not meant to be alone. We just were alone for so long. It's hard to not be alone or not feel alone when you don't trust other people. But to trust is to take a risk. And we had to take many, many risks. It's just that after taking so many for so long, we don't want to take anymore. But all the greatest gifts we were ever given came through taking a risk. And to trust is to do just that. As soon as we get to understand that we can trust, we can realize who we are. We're actually not angry. We learned a bad lesson, and that lesson was that anger is a really good tool to use to get people to do what you want them to do. But how did that work? How did that work in your home? I saw adults get angry all the time. It didn't give them power. It made them powerless. It didn't give them control. They were out of control. But I also saw at times, and I saw this in myself, when you're able to take all of this anger, right, and use it as fuel and drive to point it towards the thing that you're most passionate about in life, to gain control of it. At times we feel that things are hopeless, but when you think about really that time for so many of these young people, they had a purpose, and their purpose was to get out of that house, and they were guided out of that house. We're guided in the same way today as long as we have that same purpose, that purpose for now. What is that purpose for now? It doesn't need to be forever. It just needs to be for now. We're not worth less because when I look at and read the stories, because I read them every night, about what these young people had to do to get out, to become adults, to be fully functioning or partially functioning. They've accomplished something that is more difficult than pretty much anything they're going to face in adulthood. What, getting a job, having a relationship, having the money you need, just doesn't compare. We're more accomplished than we know. And yes, it is easy to feel self-conscious when you believe all this stuff. But the moment that we begin cultivating in each day these emotions, these truths, reminding ourselves of them, we begin to feel the same way that everyone else sees us. And then when we begin to share these truths, sharing these truths with others, when we begin to do that, then this idea of being unloved just kind of melts away, because we're giving others the gift that we never had, which is to know the truths about ourselves. So if everyone knew that, and if that was understood, you know, what's the impact of that? Well, then we can begin to positively rewire a developing brain. We can encode a series of positive beliefs early in life. And the brain doing its job, it seeks to find evidence that it believes is true. And these are really the gifts given for the price that was paid in childhood. And there are many things that we can do, that we can collectively do. One of them is we must cultivate these truths in ourselves. We can't share them until we cultivate them. We must spend time with them. They must become part of us. And then once we do, we can become the one for another by sharing these truths with someone else, which all of the research points to is the pathway to resiliency. Making certain that someone steps in to help them see what they may not be able to see for themselves. Many of the truths are outlined in the book Invincible that Gretchen mentioned earlier. All of the money that goes to buy the book, all of the royalties go back to CDV, so it's all a nonprofit venture. And I think you'll find many of the stories in there, no matter how difficult you've had it or how difficult the people you've had the privilege to touch have it. Many people find themselves in those stories, and they say, wow, you know, if they can do it, perhaps I can too. And then lastly, you know, I'm so sorry for the glitches here. I'm sure Stephanie's done a great job going through the slides, because I couldn't get, you know, I'm sure she's matched this up. But let's stay in touch. If there's anything that I can be of help with, anything that we can be helpful with, please reach out to me directly.
All right, so we'll open it up for questions. If you could type your question into the question box. Brian, I'll be happy to read those as those come in.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, we'll give people a minute here. All right, it looks like we've got a pretty silent audience.
That's okay. These are one of the first steps is to share, and well, that's certainly not the first step. The first step is to become aware, then it's to understand, then to share.
Yes.
So this is a difficult thing to ask or anything about. So I completely understand that. That is quite common.
Great. Okay. Here are a few questions that are coming in now. How do we get a copy of your documentary?
If you go to CDV.org, there's a store, and the store is right there, and there are copies that you can order. Again, obviously, all of that money goes back to the foundation as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Are the slides going to be made available? Yes, those will be made available. The title of the book is Invincible. We have someone who asked, what exactly are the 10 lies?
Oh, the 10 lies are that the lies that we believe about ourselves. So when you talk to the researchers, and there are magnificent researchers in this area, what most commonly to people who grow up in these homes, what do we believe about ourselves? We believe we are guilty. We believe there's a great shame. We believe that we are just sad people. We believe that we're angry. We're fearful. We're resentful. We're meant to be alone. We're hopeless. We're worth less than others. We're self-conscious of ourselves. And we're unloved. So not to say that one person believes all of those equally, but those are the most common lies, the most common emotions that are bullshit, that we believe about ourselves that really aren't true, that come back from a time when we were children. And, as the researchers say pretty clearly that, and I was shocked when they said this to me, and these are people who research brains, and he said, it's one of the weaknesses of our species, and it is that the brain seeks to find evidence that it believes it's true. So when I believed early on that absolutely there's no way that I should have let what happened in my house happen. I should have, without question, killed that guy. And I tried a few times. I just failed. How can I possibly let that happen in my house over and over again every night? What type of man am I? What type of person am I? I certainly am not courageous. I am weak. I have no confidence. And therefore, just one of the lies, I then found evidence throughout my young life and into adulthood to believe. But when you ask someone like, really, would you really expect a 7-year-old to be able to stop an adult, to control the actions of an adult? Do you really think that's, would you expect that of your own kid? And when you hear that as an adult, it's like when your adult brain hears it, you start to think about it differently. But the adult brain never hears it because nobody talks about it. We didn't know what to call it. So that was a long answer. Sorry it's so long.
No, that's
but those are the lies.
great. Okay, so let's see. Let me read some of these. So people are asking how to get a copy of the PowerPoint. We'll be sending that to you following the webinar. We have another person asking, do you have a website with resources we can use to educate? And that is cdv.org. Brian, do you have other resources available there that they can use?
We do, yeah. If they go to CDV, they can. They're available there.
Great. Okay, we have someone asking if you could expand a little more on the CDV Foundation.
Yeah, I mean, it was started 7 years ago, and the purpose of it really is to elevate the awareness of childhood domestic violence and to create tools that are scalable tools that other organizations who are doing more hands-on intensive work can utilize. So as an example, we want to create tools that are really low cost or free for, organizations like the NCADV to use to share with their shelters. So that's what our purpose is.
Great. Okay, we have someone ask, oh, I just lost a question. Are there tools that we can use to help rewire the kiddos that we are so blessed to become the one for?
Oh, wow, what a wonderful question and a beautifully phrased question. Yes, on our website, we have a free training program that is certified by UNICEF. They recommend it and use it, and it's called the Change a Life program. And it takes about 30 minutes, but if you go through this training program, it was built by Jeff Edelson, who is one of the best researchers in the world, and he's on our board, and we just think he's marvelous. And he built it. We built it in conjunction with him. It is free. It's on the website. It's in Spanish. It's in English. We're working on a few different languages. But if you take that program for 30 minutes, you will have the most up-to-date information in you as to how you can step in and change the life of a young person who's growing up living with domestic violence. And what the most interesting thing is, most of the adults that take it were these children. And the adults wind up learning as much as the children who wind up benefiting from the information.
Great. There's someone asking how to get a code to take that program.
I think that Stephanie can, Stephanie, we should find, we'll provide a code to Gretchen, and then we'll provide a free code to Gretchen, and then maybe we can somehow connect it to the webinar link or some other way. Gretchen, if that could work for you?
Yes, we can do that. Let's see. Are there any documentaries other than The Children Next Door that you recommend?
You know, I can tell you I'm not familiar with a ton of them. That's why we made The Children Next Door, because we couldn't find one. Then we were looking for a children's program, and we couldn't find one of those either, so we worked with Nickelodeon to create a children's program that we're really very proud of. It got nominated for an Emmy last year. That, too, is in the CDV store. And I'm not, you know, I'm just not aware of other ones.
Okay. Let's see. What story from a survivor of childhood DV who healed and broke the cycle of abuse most stands out to you? Can you briefly share that story? I find those stories helpful to me to get the public, I find those stories help me to get the public to get involved in the movement to end DV.
You know, it's a great question, and what I'd love to do is if you can send us your, maybe through Gretchen, and then Gretchen can send it to Stephanie, your mailing address, we'll send you a copy of the book, Invincible. And there are so many stories in there. It really just depends on the adversity that you faced. You know, there are stories in there of people who grew up in homes where they experienced many adversities. There was no physical violence in their home. There was no physical violence between their parents. And they grew up living like one of the worst lies, which is, you know, what the hell's wrong with me? I didn't have it that bad. Why do I feel this way? Why is my life not where I thought it would be? Why am I not able to parent the way I want to? And when you don't believe you're worthy of compassion because your home wasn't so bad, she actually started that out when I interviewed her. She said, you know, I kind of feel bad, like I shouldn't be talking to you. And I said, why? She said, because it's like my pain, you know, my pain isn't as, I didn't experience all the other bad stuff that everyone else did. It's like her pain wasn't even good enough. She was so worth less that her pain wasn't even worthwhile to have compassion for it. So I think you know, we'll send you the copy, and the story is, it really is just going to be the story that you, I think the story first that matches up your own experience, and then from that you'll read stories that will remind you of other people in your family and other people that you've had the privilege to help, or people that you need the help.
Great. We've got some more great questions coming in. Can I read a few more to you?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, great. So they say you may have mentioned this, but is the documentary available yet? And if so, where can I go to watch it?
You know, why don't we send out, Stephanie, I think we have a link on Vimeo that's password protected. Is that, if that's right? If that's still up, can we make that available for Gretchen? It is available for sale on the CDV site, and all the money goes back to the foundation. But let's, you know, if we have it still on Vimeo, we'll certainly offer it to you, anybody who's here for free to watch.
Great. Okay. What kind of therapy is best for survivors of domestic violence?
You know, when you get into the topic of therapy, there are so many different types. I can tell you that from my own experience, the people that I've interviewed, for them, the most efficacious therapy for them occurred in naturally occurring relationships. And it happened when they became aware that this was the one missing piece of all these adversities, right? There are these 10 adversities that you experience growing up in your childhood home. And these are the same adversities that the ACE study, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, cite. And in my home, there were like 4 or 5 of them. None of those bothered me. You know, the fact that one of my parents was incarcerated, the fact that there was, you know, drugs and alcohol around all the time, the fact that, you know, I experienced physical child abuse. None of them really bothered me. It was the unnamed one. It was the quipiv that I had no idea what it was, what to call it. That was the thing. And for many people, that is the thing. The one missing piece that they just didn't quite fully understand was a thing and had an impact. And the moment that someone becomes aware of that, then the moment they choose to understand it a little bit more, it's kind of like when you first hear of it, it's like a bill you don't want to open because you don't want to see what's inside. But when you actually open the bill, then you can understand. And then after you understand, you share. And when you share, that which you share tends to become the therapy that you needed. Great.
Let's see, are there any other materials that you can recommend for learning to help the kids that we are helping?
You know, I really believe that, you know, there are so many great resources, but I mean, you know, I really do believe that when you look at the television program that we created with Nickelodeon, which is for children, it's just remarkable, and you got to watch that. I think that is just in 25 minutes. It is such a caring tool. The Change of Life program is just gives you all the information you need in about 30 minutes. And, you know, whether you listen to the audiobook of Invincible, which is available, or buy the book, it really is a distillation of so much of the information that's out there, but also coupled with, all right, great, now what can I do about it that's actionable and new?
Great. We have 2 more questions. Let's see, has the Change of Life program been used with batterers at all?
It has not. It's not been. It was just entered into. It's going to be presented in New York City this spring. They're going to be presenting the research behind the Change of Life program. And I don't know what date that is, but it's in New York City this spring. I know we'll have information on the CDV Facebook page about it. But we did not include a segment that was a batterer segment. I can tell you that, you know, of the men who I've met who are in domestically violent relationships, I can tell you personally, 80 to 90%, and I've met a lot of them, and this is also corroborated by other researchers, grew up in these homes. 80 to 90% of them grew up in these homes. And while we can label them batterers, because there was certainly a batterer living in my home, that's for sure, but there came a time where, you know, we have to begin to think about them as, maybe they were just boys like me, or boys who grew up in these homes and never unlearned what was learned. Does it excuse the behavior? Of course not. Does it begin to explain it? Yeah.
Great. Okay, the last question is, how can you help parents that are in a shelter with their kids mend those relationships and try to reverse the impact that the violence has had on the kids?
One of the 90%, the data that we have suggests that 90% of parents believe that either their children didn't really see much of it, didn't hear much of it, or aren't really impacted. But 90% of the children you talk to say, oh no, I knew everything that was happening. So there's a huge disconnect in communication, and that really is the first step. Anyone who's in a domestic, in a shelter right now that has kids, they should take a look at the Change Your Life program, because that's going to give them the information they need to share with their kids. Who better to be the one for a child than their own parent?
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, well, that looks like that's the end of the questions. Do you have any final comments, Brian?
No, I'm so sorry that this was a bit messed up technologically, but I hope that it was still, I hope the content that was helpful. I hope the hour that we spent was helpful. We did kind of still stay on track. So I really appreciate you taking the time. Time's so valuable. And I hope that that didn't interrupt any of the distillation of the information.
Well, yeah, you got a very nice comment and says, thank you, Brian. I think you just changed my program significantly.
Oh, well, I think you've changed it. Thank you for the kind words.
Yes, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brian, for your patience.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you to all. Let us know if you have questions.